This show was recorded in Narm, Melbourne, Australia, where the traditional custodians include the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I'm Trip Collins, and this is Book Science, the podcast that explores how the best science books are written and why they matter. Hello, and welcome back to Book Science. There have been rapid fire changes in the U.S., and I've had to record this episode a couple times, and each time, a few weeks apart, I found myself having to update something because of the velocity of the changes. I am recording this April 2025, so surely by the time you hear this, there will be some new outrage, but I feel compelled right now to address the ongoing attack on science. So the new administration in the U.S., they've implemented drastic cuts to the federal workforce, especially in scientific agencies. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, is one such target of funding cuts and layoffs. And so far, over 800 people have been laid off, and 2 buildings are set to have their leases canceled. And even more drastic changes are being proposed in their budget for 2026, which, as written, eliminates NOAA's Oceanic and Atmospheric Research Office and its 10 research laboratories and 16 affiliated cooperative institutes. So this would close all of NOAA's weather, climate, and ocean laboratories and cooperative institutes. The speed at which these decisions are being made means there's no opportunity for feedback or consideration of long-term impacts. The scientific unions in the U.S. are beginning to respond. The American Meteorological Society, which is a scientific organization that includes the scientists that work on weather, they've released a statement, and I would like to read in full the first 3 paragraphs of the statement. U.S. leadership in scientific innovation is at risk due to the recent and ongoing reductions in the U.S. federal science capabilities. The consequences to the American people will be large and wide-ranging, including increased vulnerability to hazardous weather. The federal science workforce and federal investments in science are central to the success of weather enterprise. The partnership between public, private, academic, and non-governmental organizations that provides information and services to protect people, businesses, and the environment. Estimates of the value of weather and climate information to the U.S. economy exceed $100 billion annually, roughly 10 times the investment made by the United States taxpayers through federal agencies involved in weather-related science and services. It is internationally recognized and highly respected means of multiplying value and benefits to the American people. Recent terminations within the government workforce for science are likely to cause irreparable harm and have far-reaching consequences for public safety, economic well-being, and the United States global leadership. So in general, it looks like the current administration is implementing an across-the-board reduction in force, which targets in particular science. It looks to maybe even cripple our ability to produce public science or publicly funded science. And they're pushing towards privatizing services which have traditionally been in the domain of the public sector, including the National Weather Service. So why would they do this? The fact is that the National Weather Service is a tremendously successful program that has saved many thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of lives, and untold billions of dollars. A push toward privatizing weather and other scientific services can only be for the financial benefit of a very few at the expense of the public good. Let me pose a very simple question. Should we restrict access to weather information if someone can't afford it? I think the answer is obvious. Weather affects everyone. Weather prediction and prediction of natural disasters is one of the most important scientific success stories of this century. And improvements in prediction have largely, if not entirely, been the result of federal scientists working for the public good. I want to lead with this because it is perhaps the most important takeaway from today's book, The Power of the Sea, Tsunamis, Storm Surge, Rogue Waves, and Our Quest to Predict Disasters by Bruce Parker. Power of the Sea is 304 pages. It was published by Macmillan. I read an electronic version on my Kindle. That might have been a mistake, but we'll get into that in a little bit as when we talk about footnotes. And full disclosure, I read this because some overlap with the book that I'm working towards on the science of ocean waves. So this means some of the topics in the book are close to me. They're close to my mind, close to my heart. And I was going into this read with a very specific mindset. It wasn't one of general interest. Like me, Parker is a subject matter expert. He's not a journalist or otherwise a professional writer. And I was paying attention to what worked well in the book and what didn't work as well. What did I want to hear more of, and where was it slow? And I was looking for what I could learn and apply to improve my own work. I noticed my critical eye coming out strongest in the sections where we cover the same material related to wind waves. Bruce Parker, he covers two wave topics that are not related at all, but they have a lot of popular appeal, and those topics being rogue waves and surf prediction for World War II. Surf prediction is perhaps the most written about story related to the history of ocean waves. It's also covered in Helen Chersky's Blue Machine, a book we'll talk about in a later episode. But here, Bruce Parker, he really gets stuck in. He devotes not one, but two whole chapters to the story of Harold Sverdrup and Walter Monk of Scripps Institute of Oceanography. Monk and Sverdrup, they cobbled together these rules of thumb using, the very little amount of data that was available at the time and some good guesswork. They brought this all together into a system for making predictions of wave heights on beaches, which was eventually used for the Allied landings in North Africa and on the beaches of Normandy, and then later in the Pacific Theater. It's a great story. It's astonishing stuff. Really a story worth telling. I've written a version myself. I don't know whether or not it'll eventually get into my book. I may publish that alongside this either on the Patreon, or maybe I'll put it on Medium. But anyways, in terms of Power of the Sea, I'll say that Bruce Parker has done a very deep dive into the history, and I learned quite a bit from reading it. Even having researched, done months and months of research on the topic myself. Very impressive. So anyway, I just want to identify my mindset up front because it biases me in a certain way, perhaps a little more critical than I otherwise normally would be. But I'm talking about it here. So I love the book. It has a Book Science seal of approval. But more than that, it's important and it's timely. With everything going on politically, I think it's a great reminder of the power of publicly funded science. In the United States, we really need this reminder that science is for the public good. It's necessary and vital to fund science that enables us to prosper, even though our country is in a location on planet Earth that is prone to natural disasters. I think it might be fair to say I'm one of the few people as interested in the oscillations of the sea surface as Bruce Parker, or maybe it's probably more accurate to say that we belong to a small club of scientists obsessed enough with the science of ocean waves and related phenomena to attempt to write a book about it. This is probably a club you can measure. Club membership you can count on one hand. I think in the case of Power of the Sea, at its core is an underappreciated scientific success story. And it's remarkable, really. So for almost all of history, acts of nature have devastated human societies. I mean, we're talking about wholly unmitigated calamities. For example, the earthquake and subsequent tsunami that destroyed Lisbon, Portugal in 1755. This killed about 40,000 people, which, this was a fifth of the total population in that city perished. And the sum of humanity's response to Lisbon, and this is true throughout most of history, was to blame the people for their impiousness and sacrilege and, ask forgiveness from an apparently cruel and vengeful God. The deadliest natural disaster in human history happened as recently as 1970 when a tropical cyclone struck present-day Bangladesh with little to no warning. The coastal flooding from the accompanying storm surge is estimated to have killed at least 300,000, possibly 500,000 people. In 1970, there were people that knew about this storm, and these people could have been sent warning, but the warning never made it. In many ways, it's a story of a failure of governance. And to tell the larger story of saving lives, this is part of the equation. Science developed slowly, in most cases over hundreds of years, and eventually we had to come to understand a bit about how the different natural systems worked. In the Western tradition of science, this means many years of careful observation, development of theory, eventually development of models and systems designed to observe and predict previously unpredictable behavior of the natural world. These predictions had to be put to use to make effective policies and issue warnings. And the whole enterprise has been incredibly successful, such that waves, storm surges, tsunamis, they no longer result in the deaths of tens and hundreds of thousands of people. This is nothing short of miraculous, and it's one of the greatest testaments to the power of science for society. This point bears repeating because we live in a time when the coastal areas of the world have never been more densely inhabited by people, yet deaths due to the occurrences of natural disasters have significantly decreased over the same time period. And this is because of our ability to predict and communicate dangers to the public. Uh, Parker's point of view is one that was molded by his career at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, aka NOAA in the US, where for a time he was the chief scientist. The mission of NOAA is to understand and protect our changing environment, and then to share this knowledge and data for the benefit of all. And preventing disaster is a big part of this mission, and of course, a key theme in Bruce Parker's book. In Power of the Sea, Parker walks through the history of events, many of them calamitous, rife with tragedy. Sometimes he spends a long time on the history of a science, for example, in the case of tides, or the retelling of specific events, as was the case for wave forecasting developed during World War II or the 2004 Indonesian tsunami. In other cases, he's rolling through historical anomalies and events at a rapid pace. And at times, it reads more like just an inventory of incidents or a catalog of catastrophes or a directory of disasters well, that's all I got. My point. While these events are interesting in the way an anecdote is interesting, I wasn't struck by the feeling that they were building up to anything greater. This is particularly true in the rogue wave section. Parker goes on and on about ships being hit by so called rogue waves, but to what end? Besides, of course, the general interest of ships and waves at sea. Have we learned anything from these cases? I think the short answer is no, not really. And I think that's is part of what makes stories of rogue waves so frustrating for me, and maybe part of their mystique and popularity in the pop culture is that in the end, the way scientists talk about rogue waves and the way mariners, the press, popularizers talk about rogue waves, they don't really have much meaningful overlap. Really, does one inform the other? Certainly, stories of rogue wave events as described by eyewitness encounters has not improved our understanding of the events, other than there's this sort of vague reinforcement of the idea that maybe there's something missing in our understanding. Maybe there's something still to learn. But it's just a notion. These are anecdotes. They're not really useful as evidence per se. And I would argue in many cases it didn't even make sense to talk about the events in terms of rogue waves because there's no measurement and no way of knowing anything about the physics or dynamics, such that we can say it was or was not a certain type of wave. And maybe it doesn't matter because the fact is that there are big waves out there, absolutely wrecking vessels. And I certainly do not deny this. What I take issue with is the framing that something is going on that cannot be explained by our current science. The insinuation that there's some kind of mysterious phenomenon, waves are misbehaving, going rogue, and scientists are just in denial. They won't admit that there's a strange and dangerous phenomena out there in the deep sea. And to go to sea is to risk your life and against an unknown superpower. Of course, rogue waves are statistical in nature, or at least the way that we understand them, and they don't lend themselves to predictions that are any better than, say, rain, where we talk about percentages of occurrence. In reality, I think, 90% of avoiding marine disaster due to waves comes down to just avoiding storms, just get out of the way of big waves. And that's big waves is something we can predict with great fidelity. We're great at that. Rogue waves, not so much. Anyways, I've sort of gone off the rails a bit here, but obviously this is a bit of a hobby horse for me. And here's the thing, I'm like actively wrestling with how to talk about this in a way that's useful, informative, interesting. I'm really annoyed by the current discourse on in the press about rogue waves. I think there's not really a mystery there. Yeah, I want to be able to address it in a more satisfying way. To bring this back to Power of the Sea, while I thought it was a very interesting read, it wasn't a wholly integrated experience. It felt uneven, maybe even a bit undecided. So while Parker's book talks about some of the science, it is really more at a surface level. He doesn't really get into the details of, say, why is a rogue wave different? What makes a rogue wave different? Why might it occur? Other than he does a little bit of hand waving about nonlinearity. And this is because he doesn't present a framework for understanding rogue waves, which might most easily be done through probabilities. But we don't go there. It's not really a book explaining the science. Is it more of a history of science? So Parker likes to footnote. The use of footnotes is maybe excessive, almost obsessive, not just for citations, but annotations and tangents. And sometimes he squirrels away bits of information that seem to be better fitted for the main text itself. I enjoy a footnote probably more than most. Blair Kinsman has this textbook first published in 1965 on waves, and it is one in which the marginalia sometimes outshines the main text. It's a great, fun read. I love David Foster Wallace's famously footnoted a supposedly fun thing that I'll never do again. But with Parker, the constant interruption and distraction, it was a bit of an impediment for the flow of the book. And here is where reading on Kindle might have been part of the issue. In the Kindle, the footnotes are hyperlinked to the back matter. If the footnotes were actually like printed in the margins, then I think the interruption would have been less intrusive. Perhaps a history of sciences where the text excels. I'm not an expert, but it appears that Parker performed some novel research in terms of the history of tides and perhaps in other areas. He physically visited archives and read through private correspondences. He's like a oceanic Robert Caro, turning every page. Despite this, there isn't a lot of evidence in terms of citations that this has been taken seriously as a piece of scholarly work in the history of science. And this might just be because of the larger framing, presenting the history within the story of the success of the predictions. And in the end, I think it's all about the predictions. This is the story he wants to tell about the application of science to predict and prevent harm from natural hazards. He uses history of science, to tell the story and spares us the detail of the physics in favor of details of the human tragedy. This probably works well for the average reader. For me, I think I would have liked to have seen that ratio reversed, a bit more physics heavy, I would have preferred. In some cases, the development of prediction plays out over a long period of time, as in the case of the tides, which lends itself to Parker's style of storytelling. But in other cases, say, for example, the history of predicting wind waves, it felt a bit unbalanced. So, the better part of 2 chapters was spent talking about wave predictions during World War II. And then basically, he compresses the next 70 years of development of these wave models into maybe 5 pages. And it creates a sense of unsteadiness in the pacing that makes the book feel a little slow at times and a little too fast at others. For me, the book strings together events, and if the event is very interesting, World War II, the 2004 tsunami, then we climb down the ladder of abstraction. We dwell for quite a while. We get to experience a place and watch an event happen in the first person almost through eyewitness accounts. Parker recalls specific stories of individuals. These events themselves are often quite interesting, and if it was a book all about interesting natural disasters throughout history, then I think Parker nailed it. But the book is supposed to be about how we went from being helpless victims of the sea to knowing it well enough that the prevention and loss of life from natural disasters is on a scale with curing a major disease. And the thesis, rather than being central, sometimes felt buried. I've spent part of this review being a bit critical about the book. Like I said in the beginning, it's not really a fair reading because I was intentionally looking for the flaws. But here's the thing, I quite like the book. No one's ever dared to take on this topic in such a comprehensive way. I've never read such a thorough history of ideas related to waves and tides and storm surges and tsunamis. And in many ways, it's a marvel. It was written by an expert. This expertise was definitely highest in the area of tides, but he was very capable elsewhere. In the acknowledgments, he credits Hendrik Tolman for checking his wave section before publication. Tolman spent his career also at NOAA, and the wave model implemented at NOAA and at many other agencies around the world was his brainchild. So there are a few higher bars you could ask to pass. The level of depth and breadth Parker achieves in The Power of the Sea is remarkable. It's really an achievement. One last note. Around the time I was first making notes about this book, Hurricane Milton slammed into South Florida. This was a major hurricane hitting a super populated area of the U.S. And so far as I know, there were only about 24 confirmed deaths. Many of these related to tornadoes that spin off the hurricane. These tornadoes are much less predictable than the track and intensity of the hurricane itself. Thanks to publicly funded entities like the Office of Naval Research, the National Science Foundation, and NOAA for supporting research into improving predictions, and NOAA for making the predictions and communicating them to the public, we were really confident throughout the process about what the hurricane was doing. We knew ahead of time how strong the storm was going to be. We knew ahead of time how big it was going to be, how fast it was moving over the ocean, and how fast it was going to move over land once it made landfall, where it was going to go. People living in the affected regions had plenty of time to prepare and evacuate. A public service like this surely saved many tens of thousands of lives. The central story of the successful application of science to understand our environment and save lives is an important one to tell, and one that gets overshadowed by ridiculous claims in our post-truth age. Federal scientists, like the ones being fired by the current administration, are responsible for this critical service. We have largely forgotten what truly devastating natural disasters feel like, and because of a well-functioning public science, we're no longer surprised by them. For anyone in doubt of the value of science to society, I encourage you to pick up Power of the Sea. That's all for now. Thanks for listening.
Hey, Trip here. Thanks so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed the show, there are a few ways you can help us keep the conversation going. First, be sure to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. It really helps us connect with more listeners. If you can, also share the episodes with friends and family on social media. We also have a Patreon, so if you have the means, please consider supporting us directly. Patreon supporters get access to the book science community and bonus content only available for supporters. The Patreon is also a great place to get in touch, and we'd love to hear from you. So what books would you like to hear us cover next? Remember, you can find show notes and all things book science, as well as everything else I'm working on at tripcollins.com. Thanks for listening. I am Trip Collins, and this has been Book Science, your invitation to think deeply, stay curious, get off the scroll, and get out into the world. Take care.